Hey guys, right now I am filming a live stream and we are going to be putting together some sewing patterns during this live stream. And I'm also going to be watching some videos about the new Epstein files that have been released. First of all, I've obviously been changing a lot of the way that I approach content on here. And a lot of that's been related to, I think, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this particular video. There are so many things that I've tried to have conversations about on social media, and people didn't want to hear it when it came from me all those years ago. There's a lot about Epstein's direct connections with a lot of the culture war topics that I've discussed over the years that, I already spoke about. I knew that sort of connection was existing, and it's quite frustrating, honestly, to be in a state right now where so many people are kind of like figuring out this thing that I already sort of figured out many years ago, especially because part of my story, part of my experience having these conversations has been that a lot of times people just harass me for talking about it, right? Like a lot of the stuff that I've tried to draw attention to, especially in the context of rape culture, I've been attacked for. I've explicitly been attacked for bringing these things up and speaking about things in the way that I do, especially from the perspective of being a feminist, right? So this is going to be a video where we go over a lot of different topics because there's a lot of things in these files. Part of why I wanted to make this video is because, girl, I'm not going to look at the files, okay? I'm not going to sit and read all of the files. I don't want to do that to myself, right? But I don't want to be completely unaware. And I found a collection of videos of people speaking about their investigations into these files. And so I wanted to watch and react to those videos as we go along today. And I wanted to just share that information for, I'm sure, the other people who also don't want to sit through and go through the files themselves, right?
There's something really interesting in those files. In October of 2011, Jeffrey met Chris Poole, the creator of 4chan. The day after that meeting, Chris decides to relaunch the poll message, stands for politically incorrect. Now, if you're not chronically online and lucky enough to have never heard of this message board, good for you. It is a cesspool of garbage. It is also hugely culturally significant, and there is a direct pipeline from that message board to where we are now. Now, it turns out that Jeffrey apparently was a huge gamer and loved 4chan, but there's another key player in this story, and that is Steve Bannon. Their connection, and their now established connection to 4chan, makes a lot more sense. Because Steve Bannon was the architect and the mastermind behind weaponizing an army of incel alt-right trolls, the same trolls that helped meme the orange clown into the presidency. This army largely mobilized after Gamergate. If you don't know what Gamergate is, I made a whole in-depth video about it. Anyways, this army of angry young nerds was basically used and manipulated by Steve Bannon to create a cultural wave of anti-left memes and propaganda, railing against wokeness, feminism, whatever. This army became more and more political, more and more alt-right, and way more conspiratorial, culminating in the Pizzagate conspiracy. Pizzagate was very interestingly timed because it basically exploded weeks before the November 2016 election. And where did Pizzagate get its start? Yes, you're right. On the poll message board. Now, Pizzagate basically fueled the myth that the orange clown was this billionaire white knight sent to battle the evil deep state. There was this demonic cabal of A-listers and government elites and billionaires who were basically part of a PDF ring. Hillary Clinton, according to Pizzagate, was one of the ringleaders. And guess who won that election? Now, right after Pizzagate, in 2017, we got the very first QAnon drop. Where, you might ask? On the poll message board. Now, we don't need to get into what QAnon is. You know what it is. But basically, when you boil it down, it was pretty much an extraordinary psychological tool to keep a cult in line. And that cult is MAGA. Now, there's not that many people that talk about QAnon today, but basically every single stupid conspiracy theory that you hear MAGA repeat over and over again today, it has its seeds in QAnon. January 6th, for example, was the direct result of QAnon. If you think this is the first and last time that a conservative political group created an insane satanic panic as a smokescreen to prevent investigations into themselves, you're wrong. Because as it turns out, according to these files, there was absolutely a group of elite government officials and billionaires doing very bad things on an island. Now, if you wanted to deflect from a lot of bad things that a lot of very powerful people were doing, and you wanted to install a very heavily blackmailed puppet who would do whatever you say to make sure that his evil deeds don't come to light, and if you are a foreign government with direct ties to a financier named Jeffrey, and Jeffrey has a meeting with the dude who created 4chan, well, let's just say you have created the most successful 15-year brainwashing campaign the world has ever seen.
And see, isn't that crazy? It's kind of crazy, like, how much this stuff all touches the same stuff, right? Like, to me, I think the thing that will always be a little frustrating is it was obvious to me. I think that I've sat at this very interesting intersection of things, because as a trans person on the internet, right? Like, I was like an early trans person online, right? Like, you literally had to kind of like creep around some of the weirder, more obscure parts of the internet to sort of find a lot of the information you want, right? And so I did some of that. And so I think maybe because I stumbled into horrible shit when I was younger, that, I wasn't really able to just kind of imagine that, like, this stuff wasn't, happening, right? Like, this stuff wasn't connected. But yeah, I remember when the QAnon thing started happening, that's when I really started getting pulled off of Facebook, because Facebook was starting to get pretty crazy. But yeah, the people who were the QAnon folks did become MAGA for the most part. And, for me, it's always been aggravating, this sort of thing, because there is a very real reason to be concerned about what's happening to kids. And I think that what's been frustrating as a survivor is you get the sense very easily that people are trying to use the sexual abuse of children to basically kind of win the argument, if anything. Like, they insert it into any sort of culture war nonsense where they want something that makes it indefensible, right? Like, if they compare it or put it in the same line of pedophilia, then, it's completely indefensible and there's no reason to, even keep talking about it, right? But like, really, I think for those of us who are survivors, it's been kind of clear where a lot of the issues are. And a lot of the issues are in places that people don't really want to dismantle, right? Like, people would rather believe that there's a crazy conspiracy where Hillary Clinton is using the pizza stores, to traffic children, than they would believe that someone like Donald Trump had any hand in any of that shit, right? And it's crazy because from my vantage point, it's impossible to kind of see it a different way, right? Like, of course, these people who rely on exploitation, rely on capitalism, rely on, this idea of supremacy and that they're better than other people and therefore deserve better treatment, of course, they would probably be involved in the abuse of children. Like, of course, right? Like, to me, it's a through line to a certain conclusion. But people would rather believe the crazy conspiracy about the people they don't even understand than see what's right in front of them. And I got to be honest, one of the things that is kind of interesting is I've had to realize that there's a whole class of our society that doesn't see it in the way that I see it. And I mean, obviously, I know that not everyone agrees with me. What I mean is, like, to me, a lot of these connections are not hard. They're not like complex or hard to understand. It's obvious. It's like inherent to the system. So it would be silly to imagine it would be a different way, right? To say that it's been like this for so long and things have been functioning like this for so long that it's kind of odd to me that people are shocked by it. Like, of course, some of the richest people in the world are abusing children. Like, they do that out of boredom, honestly. What else are you going to do when you don't work? What else are you going to do when you have everything you need? For some people, cruelty is just the next natural step, right? And of course, they would try to construct all this shit to make it seem like it's everyone else. Like, as a trans woman, it's been always very patently obvious that all of this shit's bullshit, right? A lot of us have the experience of being harmed when we were children. We would never want that to ever happen to a child. At the end of the day, that is often not in line with what survivors need. And there's always like this completely divorced conversation that we end up having where, like, survivors, their needs are never really met. They're never really addressed, right? But we have this like conspiracy theory about, the thing that, the strange person must have done. And that's given so much more air. And I think very intentionally, I think also part of it for me is because I've been a person who's been, in new media for so long. You have to really, at a certain point, recognize that certain stories, certain conversations are high lit, like they will highlight certain things and draw extra attention to certain things, even when they probably shouldn't, because it reaches the conclusion that certain people want it to reach. Do you know what I mean?
It's 5 a.m. and I can't stop reading the Epstein files because so far I found out that apparently Epstein and Steve Bannon overthrew Theresa May's government in the UK, or at least that's what they claim. And Steve saying Epstein while he was with Boris Johnson, the guy who replaced Theresa May. And then Epstein was actually texting other people saying like, oh yeah, we're literally overthrowing the English government right now, as he referred to it. I've seen texts of a guy called Benny Shanghai, never heard of him, had to look him up. He's an Israeli businessman. And there's a text from Epstein in 2018 where he is saying, oh, the trip to Qatar was successful then. What's happened is because of us. And they were referring to the news. And when I searched the news on that day, that's the day that all of like the Middle East cut off their diplomatic ties with Qatar in a major diplomatic crisis that was kicking off in 2018. I have seen so many texts that basically show that Steve Bannon and Epstein were coordinating and working together across Europe to create and network a far-right movement. He was secretly meeting, this was Epstein and Bannon, I think, there's so many texts. He secretly met with the Slovakian ambassador to the United States, and that's now all kicking off in Slovakia. He was meeting with like one of the former leaders of Norway. And by the way, in 2019, some of this is in 2019, like months before he dies. In one of the texts, he's saying, oh yeah, just met up with the Prime Minister of France. That's not Emmanuel Macron because he's the president. I don't even know who was the prime minister at the time because there are so many names in the files. What the fuck? There are thousands of pages and I can't, I need to go to bed.
This was something that I think a lot of us knew was happening. Like from where I was sitting, it was very obvious that there would be this desire to get like an international far-right movement popping off. In fact, if you watched my video about the rebranding of white nationalism, I talk about that, the connection between the UK and the US and their far-right white supremacist movement, right? This is something that's happening across the world, right? We saw a little bit of that with Elon and the AfD, right? He deliberately went to go support them because he's part of that. He's part of this specifically white supremacist push. And it sounds conspiratorial, but it really isn't. That's the part that's really frustrating to me about this is that, like, I think some of us feel very distant from the history of our countries because, obviously time has passed, right? But a lot of these countries were created to kind of be like white supremacist homes, They were kind of created to be ethno-states. That's also part of why they're so involved with Israel, right? Because they like what Israel's doing. And so for me, it's a little aggravating because there's a reason to pay attention to this stuff. And a lot of people at the time when I tried to talk about this didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear that all of these things were connected.
Millions of pages of the Epstein files were released, and they are traumatic, I think, especially if you're a survivor. But there's also details in this release that connect with how we got here specifically. And what I mean by that is the online radicalization of young men, the manosphere, conspiracy culture, and also MAGA. And it starts with World of Warcraft and 4chan. I was a community manager during Gamergate, and at the time, I thought that harassment was horrible, but I didn't think that it would then become the blueprint to radicalizing young men. Files show that Jeffrey Epstein had an interest in 4chan and then later contacted the creator of 4chan, Chris Poole. If you don't know like internet history, this is where in the early 2000s where a lot of the misogyny and harassment culture was cultivated. They often mobilized and organized targeted attacks against SJWs or feminists online. Epstein then contacted Chris Poole to organize a meeting. And directly after that meeting, Chris created r/Poll, which if you don't know is r/politically incorrect, which was like a cesspool of like conspiracy and misogyny and just like think of like the most alt-right content. That's where it lived. Okay, so we talked about 4chan. Now, how does this connect to World of Warcraft and Gamergate? Well, Steve Bannon, Trump's ex-chief strategist, used to be the CEO of a WoW gold farming company. You know, before his political career, he was one of those online places where you would pay money to buy gold in World of Warcraft. But what Bannon did was he also studied the men in those spaces, and he described them as literally ruthless white males with monster power. And then he sold how to mobilize those men to Trump's campaign during his first administration. Epstein files show Epstein coaching Bannon in real time during a pro-Trump media push in 2018. They were cultivating an army of young, isolated, angry men that were ready to be pointed at their targets. And their targets were women. Specifically women online and women in the game industry. Bannon understood something pretty crucial. You don't need to give these young men facts. You just need to give them a common enemy based off of a pre-existing framework of misogyny, and then be able to dress up the rape and death threats they would send women with. It's just about ethics in game journalism. In Gamergate, the enemy were SJWs, feminists, and wokeness. While misogyny has always existed, they made the pipeline. They made the manosphere. And a lot of the misogynistic rhetoric we hear now online on this app was first created, formed, perfected during Gamergate. They trained and weaponized these young men so that they can be pointed at any target that they needed. Mobilize a crowd, give them a villain, and call it a crusade so that you don't get caught.
Gamergate was an interesting time because I think there's a weird amount of amnesia around it, right? Like, I remember what it was like. I was one of the very few feminist content creators on this platform, and I got harassed quite a bit. In fact, one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this video and talk about this subject is because of that experience, right? So many people harassed me and a lot of other content creators for making what I know were very baseline, easy feminist 101 concepts, simple concepts like women should exist in a story without being objectified or without exclusively existing in the scope of a man's existence and storyline, right? Stuff that for, I think, a lot of us was like basic, was still quite upsetting to a lot of people. And I think at the time, a lot of that had to do with a lack of literacy around feminism and a lack of understanding of women's experiences, right? Like at the time, I think we were still in the early stages of us having the free communication that we do now. And it's sort of hard for me to really necessarily buy it, but I can buy now looking back that there were a lot of men who simply did not truly really understand what it was like in the world for a woman. And I think a lot of the people who are having these conversations, you have to think about who had access to the internet at the time too. These were people who were largely kind of sheltered from a lot of these conversations. I think a lot of people don't understand that the average person online 20 years ago even was like a person whose parents worked in an office job that had internet who had a reason to have internet at home, right? So there's like a whole layer of people who were really only online because they were in a certain tax bracket. And a lot of people were able to establish their internet careers because they were in a situation where they could do that, right? Like they could create content on the internet and largely be unaffected by it in their real daily lives, right? Like I think it's very privileged to be able to do what we're doing here, right? For a lot of people, I think they were speaking from the perspective of what they knew. And for a lot of, especially young men at the time, they were only really aware of what was put in front of them, right? Like, I don't want to give these men too much credit because I don't think there was any truth at all to Gamergate bullshit. But I know now, because there's so many people that have since kind of like changed their tune, that there were just a lot of people who didn't believe women. And this is a common theme, actually, in a lot of this stuff, because people have been coming out and speaking about a lot of the stuff in these emails for a really long time. And the consistent thing you see time and time again is that people don't believe women, right? People don't want to believe women. And then within our misogynistic society, there is already this built-in distrusting of women and their ability to even understand what's happening to themselves. And you listen to the way that some of these men are talking about women, and you kind of get the sense that a lot of these men themselves accept the premise that women don't quite have the ability to think for themselves and function with their own best intentions in mind, right? So it's a common theme. It's a very strong theme. And I can grant that maybe some of these men didn't know, but at the end of the day, all of it was an outgrowth of a very real misogyny that very much was cultivated in our culture and was looking, I think, for a place to be expelled. And what I think happened back then is you had a lot of young men who were very angry about their station in life, right? The way that maybe a lot of capitalism wasn't working in their favor. And they needed an outlet. And for a lot of men in a misogynistic society, women are the easy targets to hate, right? Women are the easy targets to attack. And for me, what would happen is, because I always sort of function from the perspective of like, I hope people are considering very deeply the people they're interacting with and the arguments that they're making, and that they're actually thoughtfully engaging in many of these conversations. But what I would see time and time again is that these people would just mindlessly attack any target that sort of fit certain things that they wanted to yell at the moment. And as a Black trans woman, obviously, there were a lot of people who chose me as one of their favorite targets. At the end of the day, a lot of what we were talking about just kind of turned out to be true. A lot of what we were having conversations with turned out to be exactly what it was. But people didn't believe us. A lot of rich men for a really long time have been able to get away with the idea of women speaking out only against them because they want attention or money or something. And so what it does is it allows them to kind of get away with it in a lot of ways, because every single time a person calls it out, they can just say, well, they were just trying to get my attention, or they, just wanted my money, or they wanted my this and they wanted my that. And, the women in these conversations are always like the greedy one trying to, steal resources. Whereas the men, of course, are always the dutiful ones who have the resources that are being exploited, of course. And at the end of the day, that's not really what's happening. What's really happening, is that a lot of men want to have leverage over women that they can use to take advantage of them. And what we see in the Epstein case and a lot of these conversations is that a lot of these men bonded with each other over that. And that's the sort of camaraderie that a lot of these spaces kind of provided. It gave a lot of young, angry, misogynistic men this sort of space to come together and to talk about how much they hated women and how frustrated they were with women. And for a lot of people, that was the community that they felt they were missing. And, that's kind of the sick part of it. Because when you really think about it, right, like a lot of the capitalist dream, it's all about isolating yourself and being far away from community, right? It's about having your own house, having your own land, having your own this, having your own that. and it all sort of working for you and only for you and primarily benefiting you. Whereas I think a lot of the problems in our society have to do with us shifting into a less communal way of being, in a way of being where instead of being within community, people are isolated, and then identifying with that isolation and that individuality and this idea that they need to be set apart from others instead of being part of a collective that's providing and taking care of each other, right? And I think that unfortunately some men, they went down the path of the red pill, as they're now calling it, right? Because that's what feels like is providing them something. And I think that as we have conversations about the so-called male loneliness epidemic and all this other stuff as it connects to this, we do have to, I think, at some point recognize that there is a wound there. There is a wound. That wound does exist, and it should be probably tended to. I don't think it should be tended to by women, though. I think men have to work on, building better communities for themselves. Because just think about what these men are doing, right? Half of these men are the kind of men that a lot of like working class dudes will sit around and think, I want to be just like them one day. And what do when they get all the money, all the power, all the ability? They attack children, right?
Interesting fact about the current political climate around the world and Jeffrey Epstein, and that fact is right at the time that the politically incorrect board was opened up on 4chan, Jeff Epstein was in a relationship with Christopher Poole, who was the founder of 4chan. Now, there are 368 mentions of Chris Poole when you search these documents through the DOJ, the first of those being from October 20th, 2011 at 2:24 a.m. with an email from Boris Nikolic. Boris Nikolic was the successor executor of Jeff Epstein's will. He was a Croatian doctor who did his postdoctorate at Harvard, and until 2014 served as the chief advisor for science and technology to the Gates Foundation. Postdoctorate was in transplantation immunology. He had a falling out with Bill Gates in 2014, so this is the person that is suggesting that Epstein meet Christopher Poole. And a nice little Woody Allen mention here, as always. Chris Poole goes over to Epstein's house. These guys are communicating into February of 2012. Allegedly, this board was created, quote, to siphon off and contain the overly xenophobic and racist comments and memes from other wings of 4chan. The board goes on to be a platform for far-right extremism. Quote, it's known for widespread racist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, misogynist, and anti-LGBTQ content. This is the muck and slime that pipsqueaks like neo-Nazi wannabe Nick Fuentes climbed out of. These are the internet trolls that this space produced. So you start to think about this, and you start to think about the fact that every single culture war you can possibly think of was coming from 4chan. Well, you have Ghislaine Maxwell allegedly using the Reddit account Maxwell Hill as a moderator of Our World News, Our Politics, and Our Technology. The account was on Reddit since 2006 and the first Reddit account to collect 1 million karma. After Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested, there was no more posting from this account. When you look at that user and then the politically incorrect board on 4chan, you see stuff normalizing the exploitation of children, which ironically is exactly what you see from Nick Fuentes now as he sells Jeffrey Epstein merch. One of the most disgusting things I see right now is the normalization of this stuff. There are memes, a lot of AI-generated slop that makes jokes about Epstein and this entire thing. Moronic pigs like Dave Portnoy making jokes about this stuff. This is not a moment to be joking about this, right? No one in their right mind would do that. This is one of the darkest operations in human history. See, I think about all this stuff and I think about patterns. I think about the fact that Steve Bannon was talking to Jeff Epstein about how he was getting in with all of the far-right movements in Europe. Epstein talking to Michael Wolff about how the far-right movement in France is being funded by Russia. I see people like Elon Musk supporting the AfD movement in Germany. I made a whole video about how the AfD movement is in support of Russia as well. And then I think about Pizzagate after the Russian hack of Podesta's emails in 2016. If you want to know where Pizzagate exploded, the answer is 4chan. What you start to see there is something that intelligence agencies in the United States have done for decades. They've done this with disclosure, with stuff about aliens. What they do is they pump out misinformation. They pump out stuff that's absolutely insane. And what it does is discredit the actual people doing the actual work to expose real stuff. What you can see is a potential reality where Jeff Epstein was taking Roy Cohn's strategy of always be attacking right. Roy Cohn was the closeted gay man who was working for McCarthy, attacking gay men and prosecuting them. You do is you take the things that your side is doing, you make baseless accusations that are huge and eye-catching, right, and you pump them out to stupid people. There were no victims of Pizzagate coming forward. There was no testimony from people saying this is what happened. It was simply internet bullshit. And then you look and you see message after message referencing pizza around Epstein. See him joking about it with Ehud Barak. You start to think about the cognitive dissonance that has grown over the past 15 years and how horrifying some of this stuff actually looks. Or you look into Jeff Epstein, you see he was pushing divisiveness, chaos, anger, and far-right ideology across the world. Realize what I've said over and over again, the more we look left and right, the less we look up. Interesting fact about the current political climate around the world and Jeffrey Epstein, and that fact is right at the time that the politically incorrect board was opened up on 4chan, Jeff Epstein was created.
A lot of y'all are going to be mad at me for this one, but it must be said. A lot of people have been calling the Epstein files just satanic, and the cabal of all of the elites that things to be satanic as well. But there's some problems with that. First and foremost, reality just doesn't operate on the simplistic binary of Christian versus demonic. That's just not how things work. That's really oversimplified, and it's oversimplified for a reason. Second of all, a lot of people are calling them satanic for a number of reasons, but a big part of that is the pedophilia, which is why for over a decade now, the alt-right conspiracy theories about the secret cabal of the elite have really been rooted in pedophilia. But the problem with that whole idea is, at a certain point, you're going to have to confront the fact that a lot of Christians are pedophiles. Not only is that the case, but Christians are known for pedophilia. And I know that a lot of Protestants just heard that and are instinctively pointing their fingers at the Catholic Church. And understandable, the Catholic Church they do got that going on. But there's a reason why every single person in America, regardless of whether or not they're even a Christian, has at least heard of some pastor touching on kids. It's kind of just what Christians do. And even if you're like, okay, I can accept that a lot of Christians are pedophiles, but that doesn't change the fact that the people in the Epstein files were murderous and cannibalistic. That's what makes them satanic. It was Christians who tortured and enslaved Black people. It was Christians who traveled to pretty much every single corner that the earth could possibly muster up so that they could rape, violate, torture, murder, conquer, and dominate. That's what colonization was. Colonization happened with the stamp of approval from Christianity. I'm not saying that you should renounce your faith and that you're just inherently evil if you identify as Christian, because some of the holiest people I've ever met have been devout Christians. But you have to acknowledge reality sometimes. The Epstein files is what Christianity was to Indigenous Americans. The Epstein files was what Christianity was to Africans who were kidnapped or taken from their home in chains and then forced on what's called the Middle Passage, one of the most horrific journeys of pretty much all of human history. The Epstein files are what Christianity was to Indians for a number of centuries. Not only were Christians the one who profited off of the global slave trade, Christians were the ones who set that system up in the first place. And that's something that's really insidious about mainstream Christianity, is that it turns you away from acknowledging the truth, history, really the past 2,000 years, but especially the past 500 years. You can't understand why anything in history has ever been, which means you can't understand why the way is the way it is now, if you can't acknowledge the fact that the devil has always done his best work in God's name. And I understand why you can't acknowledge that, because the second you do, you're going to have to ask yourself why that is. But this is why things like Christian history and biblical scholarship are so important, regardless of whether or not you're a Christian. The Christian God is known by the Tetragrammaton, the fourfold name of God, the true name of God. And that's associated with the words Jehovah and Yahweh. Before Christianity even stepped out on the scene, Yahweh was the god of Judaism. But even before that, Yahweh was a god of the Canaanite pantheon. So you know how in the files they mentioned Baal, the demon? Baal was actually part of that, the Canaanite pantheon, along with Yahweh. Oh, but Baal, isn't he a demon? Yeah, in Christianity he is. But that was Yahweh saying, you know that bitch I used to hang out with? A lot of people point out the fact that Yahweh was a storm god, and while that is true, he wasn't just a god of storm and weather and all of that. He was also a god of war. That's why even now the Christian God is known as the Lord of Hosts. Like, he's not just like the hostess with the mostest. Like, that refers to like hosting an army. He's the Lord of Armies. Once again, it's important to point out that a lot of people in the Epstein files are, of course, part of the elite, but the vast majority of the elite are born into it, and they have been for centuries. That's why the people who are doing the global slave trade, like the people who are rich now, that's where they got their money from. That's their great-great-great-granddaddy. And you notice how their great-great-granddaddy considered themselves to be Christians? You notice how, like, how it's always people who identified as Christians doing all of this? To them, this is the way the world has always been. It's all of these other people have to suffer so that I can have my heaven on earth. That's what the elites have always been doing. Like, that's always how they view the world for, once again, I was going to say literal centuries, but millennia, actually. The Epstein files aren't satanic. You're just now seeing what Christianity was to all of the people who were colonized. And it's not even like just the Christianity that the colonized saw, because anyone living under Christendom who was not wealthy, they suffered. They all suffered. Just because you're brainwashed into it from birth doesn't mean that it's not negatively impacting you. Just the same way as whenever you find something like grand and holy within that doesn't mean that it's not negatively impacting you. It sure as hell doesn't mean that it can't negatively impact anybody else. And while being Christian doesn't make you inherently evil, if you're a Christian and you can't acknowledge the obvious reality of what Christianity has been like for both Christians and non-Christians throughout all of Christian history, you can't do that and follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, because if you actually followed the teachings of Jesus Christ, you would look around and see all of the evil being committed in God's name, which, by the way, that's what the commandment of thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain, like, that's what that actually means. It's not just saying like, oh no, don't say oh my God. It's saying like, yeah, I'm a Christian, but whenever somebody calls my church and asks for baby food, I'm gonna fucking laugh at them. Like, that's not what Jesus had going on. But there's a reason why following the teachings of Jesus Christ and being accepted in Christian communities is often oxymoronic. You can't really have both at the same time, or at least not to a full extent. And that's because a lot of Christian communities aren't actually based in like the teachings of Jesus Christ or the Bible. It's based in maintaining the status quo. Do you think Jesus would hear somebody saying, oh yeah, we have more than enough food in the world to end world hunger, but you know, if we give food to people, then our shareholders won't be rich anymore? Y'all always bring up the story in the Bible where Jesus was flipping tables, chasing people around with a whip, because y'all are not supposed to turn the house of God into a place of profit. Like, how do you think that dude would feel about capitalism? Once Jesus was resurrected, the first people he spoke to and told to go spread the gospel, the good news, were women. How do you think that dude would react to hearing y'all say, oh, women aren't supposed to speak in the church, women can't be in leadership positions, women are supposed to be like locked inside in the home at all points in time? And I've seen a lot of Christians making fun of Mormons because like, oh, the Mormons believe that this dude who was in America like not too long ago, like he was like a messiah. But a lot of those same Christians live and die by the concept of the rapture, which was invented in the 1830s. No, Jesus did not talk about something that, like, an idea that didn't even come up for, like, damn near another 2,000 years. Like, y'all don't actually listen to what Jesus was saying. Y'all don't actually, like, read the Bible and think about it and, like, comprehend it and, like, think about the way that the language has changed throughout time. Y'all just listen to somebody tell you what it means and you just blindly follow. Where is the relationship with God? Where is it? Running out of time, but yeah, that's what the Epstein files have always been. Like, yeah, the Christianity has always been the Epstein files. Sorry you had to find out this way, genuinely. A lot of y'all are going to be mad at me for this one, but it must be said.
I loved that video because, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that is what this is. I mean, as much as people want to act like there is no, relationship between these things. There really is, right? Christianity does normalize a lot of things that it probably shouldn't be, really probably shouldn't be, right? And like I said, this is one of them. I think the point she made about, everyone knowing a Christian pastor who's done that. Yeah. And the thing is, I'll share this. There was a time where I was working on a single video about a particular MAGA pastor who had come out as a person who had harmed some children. When I tell you that I found myself wanting to add story onto that one video because there kept being instances of these like MAGA pastors being revealed as people who harm children. And at the end of the day, I think you have to be honest about how common that is. Yes, Christianity is a very common religion, but the abuses of these children shouldn't be as common as it is. And unfortunately, it's a bit more common than I think it really truly should be. It's frustrating to me that a lot of people don't see how all these things sort of relate. That at the end of the day, when you show indifference towards the stuff that's happening in the church, it naturally leads to things like this. Secret spaces where men are free to abuse children who are never going to be believed, right?
I see a lot of people flabbergasted and disgusted by files, rightfully so. We're seeing names come out of, famous people, politicians, billionaires, and I can see that people are horrified. Now, I also see that conspiracy theorists, they finally feel seen. They feel, I've been saying this for years. Now people see the truth. But the thing is, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. You just have to be into pattern recognition. Because what did the Romans, the Greeks, Marvin Gaye, and Elvis Presley all have in common? Also, why is the highest level of sexual assault happen by people you already know? And it's because the truth is much simpler than like an evil cabal of pedophiles, or that, there's a curse on the world because some group of people are praying to demons. The plain and simple truth is that the patriarchy unchecked is pedophilia. Let me say it again. The patriarchy, at its highest form, the patriarchy unchecked is pedophilia. Because the patriarchy tells us that your ability to physically dominate another person gives you the right to rule over them. If an empire has the means to colonize another people, they have the right to rule over them. The patriarchy tells us that men deserve leadership positions within society because they can physically dominate the women and children around him. That's why you hear, far-right, red-pilled podcasters say that women are lucky. Women are lucky that they're not being dominated at higher rates by men. So by that same thinking, the patriarchy tells grown men and adults that they have earned the right of authority over children because they can dominate them. And notice how I said authority and not responsibility. And that's why this issue is much deeper than the Epstein files. Because sure, he named his bank account Ball after a demon. But let me tell you about a couple Catholic priests. Let me teach you about someone named Joseph Smith. Look up on the news, Christian pastor. It's because it doesn't have to do with a specific deity, and it doesn't have to do with a cabal of secret society. No, pedophilia. Pedophilia is the patriarchy unchecked. It's the highest form of misogyny. That doesn't mean women can't be pedophiles, because women can emulate the patriarchy. You do so by asserting dominance on those who are physically less capable than you. Coupled with capitalism, you can then dominate people if you are financially more powerful than them. Mix the two together and you have the Epstein files. I say this because the real battle is not going to be with the files themselves and the people in the files. While I want to capture and do what needs to be done to every single name mentioned in these files, the real battle is with this system, this invisible system that we have been accustomed to even in our minds. We have to start pushing back on these ideas of things like the man of the house, or telling our kids, do this or do that because I said so. These are the ideas that let things like pedophilia fester into our society. We need to stop treating these red pill arguments like they have any validity. When a man says something along the lines of women losing their worth or their beauty over time, you're a pedophile. When a man says something like, you should be grateful that men don't physically assault you, you're a pedophile. Because as long as we don't change that, as long as we don't change this idea of dominance equates power, things like the Epstein files will continue to fester within our societies. The Greeks were doing it, the Romans were doing it, and it's all because of this idea of dominance equals power. Instead of indigenous practices of stewardship, land, child, and animal responsibility instead of authority. So remember, the patriarchy unchecked is pedophilia.
Yeah, so I loved that video because I thought it was so true. And I absolutely agree. The patriarchy unchecked is pedophilia. And that's kind of the point I was trying to make earlier, right? Like, there's this way that all of these things are supposed to slot into a perfect spot. And that spot is usually one where, yeah, it is kind of understandable that a grown man would want to have, maybe a couple of children with a very, very young woman, right? A lot of these ideas kind of rest upon that. And they are in so many ways being pushed by people who want to do that thing, right? You really see that after you look at more of these files, right? A lot of men only feel powerful in a relationship with a woman when they can dominate her in one way or another. And for a lot of men, feeling powerful is like one of the big reasons why they're in that relationship. And for a lot of men, this is an idea that does come from patriarchy that they often do learn through church, a Christian system predominantly in this country that says that God is at the top. And if you're just beneath God, who of course is a man, you are above a woman, right? And that woman is, of course, above the child, right? And so all of these sort of structures are supposed to benefit the man, right? Even as a man, you're supposed to be submissive to God, who, of course, is within the Christian idea of it, supposed to be a man, right? God is supposed to be a man. And so for a lot of men, they only really feel masculine when they are dominating a woman and in some way being submissive to an higher male figure, right? Some could argue that this is why some people didn't want to vote for a woman as a president, right?
Jeffrey Epstein sent this, like the Pope article, now reading how God exercised improper power dynamics with the Virgin Mary, no consent. Jeffrey Epstein learned it from who did we? Every victim in the Epstein file is the Virgin Mary, and not because they're pure and innocent, but because we've been taught that their body's pain doesn't count. Christianity's inability to sit with the troubling complexity of Mary's story has made it a training manual for how to not see grape, how to erase what happens to women's bodies, how to only count the suffering that doesn't threaten male power. This is the pattern that founded this country. The founding fathers raped and had children with enslaved black children. Jefferson with Sally Hemings was 14, about the same age as Mary when she conceived Jesus. One story we call holy and the other one complicated, a relationship, a liaison, anything but what it actually is. Epstein didn't invent anything. He just carried on the torch. In 2013, Epstein commissioned this investigation into the origin of the Little St. James Island, which becomes the Epstein Island, to see if he can change the official name. The research came back and it was named after the relative of Virgin Mary, and he started calling it the Little St. Jeff. 5 years later, he sent that text. He was studying Mary's lack of consent while enacting what happened to Mary on the island bearing her family's name. This wasn't just passive cultural conditioning. It was conscious theological engagement. Where did he learn that a powerful man impregnating a young girl, especially one with no legal personhood, no ability to refuse, could be anything but grape. He learned it from Mary. We learned it from Mary. That when the man is powerful enough, important enough, chosen enough, what happens to her body can be called sacred destiny, participating in something larger than herself. This theological template for accepting predation became the template for political power, oligarchical power, and all of these systems required us to believe that certain men's access to certain bodies is just part of the natural order. The Bible was written by men in a world that treated women's and girls' bodies as available to male power. Whether the authors intended to justify the systems or portray the systems or simply could not imagine anything else, the effect is the same. We inherited Epstein's textbook, the sacred text that teaches us not to see violation as violation if the man is powerful enough. This is a 12 to 14-year-old girl impregnated by God who says, "Let it be done unto me," when the power dynamic is a child versus the entire cosmic order. This surrender to overwhelming force is what we call holy. This is how we theologize predation, as sacred, as inevitable as the way things are. Her impregnation is this floating signifier of receptivity to male power, no matter earthly or divine. The only good woman whose body is untainted by sex and yet has evidence of sexual activity is Mary. And yet she experiences no sexual pleasure throughout her life because she has to remain perpetually virgin. Her pain, her tearing, her recovery from labor is fully erased. This mother of sorrows, her only acceptable suffering is emotional, watching her son die at the cross. And even then at the cross, Mary is silent, sorrowful, and contained. What if she screamed and refused to make meaning, refused to witness silently, demanded that this shouldn't have happened to her body? And then there's the assumption where Mary doesn't even get to die. Her body just disappears entirely. What would Mary's story be if it was written by a woman? What world can we build if a young girl's body isn't required for the human and divine to meet? This isn't rejecting Mary. It is seeing her and asking, what happened to her body? What did pregnancy feel like at 13? What did childbirth do to her? Where is her rage, her fear, her bodily autonomy? Skipping over the body to get to the meaning, the redemption of every story of violation is how we learn to tell survivors that their suffering should have a purpose, that they should heal in ways that make us comfortable, that they should turn their violation into inspiration. Accepting that power dynamic, divine over human, enslaver over enslaved, billionaire over teenager, is how we learned as a society that women's bodies don't register pain for themselves, only for others. We are only here to watch, to witness, to never be angry, to help erase the injustice done to us. This is why we ask victims, are you pure enough? Did you resist enough? Were you too knowing, too complicit? Did you also say, let it be done unto me? The files are out, but can we see what's in them when we've been trained for 2,000 years not to look at women's bodies at all? Do we still know how to look?
So I absolutely loved the way that this creator put that because it's so true. I mean, when you really look at all of this, this shit is all connected. Again, like there's a reason why Jeffrey, who isn't Christian, is so deeply into Christian theology and the way that it can be used to kind of justify what he's doing, right? In these emails, it's pretty clear that not only does he not believe in Christianity, but he has a certain supremacy to him about his own religious background. And so it's worth pointing out that these are narratives that he's clinging to because he knows that they have a way of justifying a certain set of actions. And one of the weird things, again, about being a survivor is you do sort of observe that our society does this thing where they pretend to care. They say that it's important. They say that if the evidence was all there, they would do something. But because it's usually a man, often a powerful one, all of that matters only in so much as that man is important, right? The more important that man is, the more he's able to get away with. And unfortunately, that's kind of just been the way that it's been for a really long time. And there are a lot of people who want to keep that alive. You'll see that in some of these messages, they were freaking out about Me Too. They were literally freaking out about the movement of women coming forward to speak about men harming them, right?
Here's Deepak Chopra emailing Epstein to say, God is a construct, cute girls are real. And this tracks with other exchanges showing that he was playing or trying to play guru for the sex trafficker using his parody of Indian philosophy. And I think it sums up a lot of the cultural labor of the New Age, which was to run cover for the crisis of predatory capitalism while enjoying its benefits. Now, I haven't examined the 4,000 plus instances of Deepak in the files, but not much would surprise me. There was a sexual harassment suit against him in the late 90s. And then in 2021, there's an anonymous account from a woman who said that he used his guru status at his Ayurveda center to pose as a therapist wizard. And she says she disclosed childhood trauma, including sexual abuse. And then she alleges he forced a sexual relationship on her. Now, all of the commentary out there so far saying that he was obviously always full of shit, a charlatan of woo, a pseudoscience huckster, all true, no notes. But I want to zoom out and talk about the work he performed on behalf of neoliberalism and why it wouldn't be surprising to me if he was trading meditation tips and tricks with Epstein for sex with trafficked women. The main cultural and political work of New Age spirituality was to lock in the depoliticization of an anxious generation of post-1960s liberals, to get them focusing on the self project rather than class solidarity. So what does that sound like? High vibrations, crystals, manifesting. Who needs feminism if you have the divine feminine? Take my course and find your flow in order to thrive in the precariat. You don't need healthcare. Here's a smoothie to pour up your ass. Yoga means union, but not the labor type. Can't afford rent, millennial starseed? Your home is the universe. All a cheesy attempt to sell people on the lie that everything would be all right in the end times of capitalism if you bought products to perfect your body. Deepak's version of this bullshit was cloaked in a cloud of quantum Orientalism and medical quackery, suggesting things like Ayurveda was as good or better at treating cancer or diabetes than chemotherapy and insulin. This old medicine also has a lot of magical boner potions for kings. This all is fascist adjacent, not only because of the anti-intellectualism, but also because claiming that reconstructed and gentrified spiritual practices are actually the futuristic technologies of ancient seers is a cultural pillar of Hindu nationalist soft power. So what about that non-dualism? Well, it helped workers check out while the oligarchs deregulated the banks. But for the owner class, God is a construct, cute girls are real, points to a philosophy of malignant narcissism. You see, non-dualism deconstructs God as a concept outside of yourself so that you can know yourself as one with the divine, tasting the endless pleasures of the world. So there's one possible New Age legacy, teaching the sociopath to relax into his divine nature so that he can enjoy all the cute emanations, or what normal people would call children.
Here's the thing about the Epstein files I just dropped. 3 million pages. You're going to see a lot of names. Elon Musk, Peter Attia, Deepak Chopra, Steve Bannon. The list goes on. But everyone is asking the wrong question. The question isn't just what did they say to Epstein? The question is, what did they already know when they said it? Let's establish a timeline. 2005, police in Palm Beach, Florida begin investigating Epstein after a parent reports that he sexually abused her 14-year-old daughter. 2006, Epstein is arrested. A grand jury indicts him on soliciting prostitution. The FBI opens a federal investigation that identifies 36 girls, some as young as 14, whom Epstein had allegedly abused. June 2008, Epstein pleads guilty to procuring a child for prostitution and soliciting a minor. He's sentenced to 18 months. He registers as a sex offender. This was not a secret. It was public record. It was in the news. By mid-2008, if you were a person of any means or sophistication in America, and certainly if you ran in elite circles, you knew. Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender who abused underage girls. Now let's look at the emails. Elon Musk. The emails start in late 2012, 4 years after the conviction. Musk writes to Epstein that they had a very enjoyable conversation. They discuss visiting Epstein's island over Christmas. Musk asks, and I quote, "What day night will be the wildest party on your island?" In 2013, he's emailing about helicopter transport to the island, asking when he should head to your island. By 2012, everyone knew. Peter Attia, the longevity guru, just hired by CBS News. Over 1,700 mentions in the files. Emails spanning from at least 2015 to 2018. In June 2015, 7 years after the conviction, Attia gushes that the worst part about being Epstein's friend is that the life you lead is so outrageous, and yet I can't tell a soul. He knew the life was outrageous. He just couldn't tell anyone. In 2016, Attia sends Epstein a joke about, you know what, I'm not even going to repeat it. You can look it up. And then in December 2018, after the Miami Herald published its devastating investigation identifying 80 of Epstein's victims, Attia emails Epstein asking if there's any legal fallout from the story. Not expressing horror, not distancing himself, checking in on a buddy's legal situation. Deepak Chopra, the spiritual guru, the self-help icon, the guy selling you enlightenment, emails spanning 2016 through at least 2018. In November 2016, Epstein shares a news article about one of his accusers dropping a lawsuit. Chopra asks, "Did she also drop the civil case against you?" Epstein replies, "Yup." Chopra responds, "Good. Good." Steve Bannon, hundreds of friendly texts months before Epstein's death. They discuss politics, travel, and a documentary that Bannon was planning so that he could help salvage Epstein's reputation. In March 2019, Bannon asked if Epstein could supply his plane to pick him up in Rome. This was in 2009. This was 2019. So here's the point. The question isn't whether these people committed crimes. That's for investigators to determine. And maybe they didn't. Maybe they just had lunch. Maybe they just talked about meditation or solar panels or longevity science. But here's what we know they did. They chose to associate. They chose to buddy up. They chose to email about wild parties and outrageous lifestyles with a man they knew, because everyone knew, had pled guilty to crimes against children. And that raises a different question, not a legal one, a moral one. Where do we draw the line? I'm not saying these people should go to jail for exchanging emails. I'm asking, why do we keep buying their cars? Why do we keep listening to their podcasts? Why do we keep paying $2,500 for their longevity programs? Why do we keep treating them like gurus and visionaries and people whose wisdom is worth following? Deepak Chopra has made a career telling you how to live a more conscious, more ethical, more enlightened life. And when his friend's accuser dropped a lawsuit, he said, "Good." Peter Attia is selling you the science of living longer. He couldn't stop himself from befriending a convicted child sex offender. These are the people we elevate. These are the people we venerate. These are the people we give platforms to and listen to and hand over our money and attention. And look, the legal system will do what the legal system does, but the legal system is not the only place where accountability happens. The market is a place where accountability happens. Culture is a place where accountability happens. Your choices about who deserves your attention, your money, your trust, that's accountability too. So maybe the takeaway from these 3 million pages isn't a client list. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's this. Stop making heroes out of people who couldn't draw a basic moral line. Stop taking life advice from people who thought a convicted child sex offender was a suitable friend. Stop buying the supplements. Stop listening to the podcast. Stop pretending that wealth or fame or the appearance of wisdom means something or someone has actual integrity. Because if you're sending chummy emails about wild parties to a registered sex offender in 2012, 2015, 2018, you don't get to be a guru. You don't get to be a visionary. You don't get to tell anyone how to live. You knew. And you stayed.
There's a lot of things to be said about the patriarchy in the context of the Epstein emails, because you really kind of see what men would be when they are at their, in quotations, best, right? A lot of these men are like the smartest men in our society. Some of them are the most supposedly capable men in our society. These are some of the richest men in our society. And what do they choose to do when they have all of that money, when they have all that power, when they have all that wealth, when they have all of that strength? They choose to turn it around on children. And they create a whole system, a whole structure based upon trying to protect their abuse of said children.
Let's talk about the men who teach us about the divine feminine. Another revealing Deepak Chopra email says, "My biological needs are met occasionally, and that he and many of younger women because he loves to engage with them to inspire them and stimulate them." And you can tell by the way he talks that he's centering himself, right? These are my biological needs. I love to be around young women because then I get to be their hero and inspire them. And I want you to notice now this pattern with male thinkers who theorize or exalt or talk about the divine feminine while actually not being great towards women. I have the same beef with Carl Jung, who wrote extensively about symbols around the feminine and divine feminine, and yet not only did he carry long-term multiple affairs that really hurt his wife, he claimed that they were psychologically necessary for him. His wife Emma was supposed to run the household, raise the children. She was a psychoanalyst in her own right, deal with all of the social consequences of his actions. And also, when she tried to leave him 3 times, he pretended that he would be sick so that she would care for him. Joseph Campbell gave us so much language around myth and story. He gave us the hero's journey, and when Maureen Murdoch brought to him the heroine's journey, because women in the hero's journey are rarely protagonists with inner lives, they're usually like the goddess or the temptress, he really saw no reason why it should exist. Like, he didn't get it. He really just assumed that the male experience was the default and saw no issue with the hero's journey just applying to everybody. So what we're seeing with Deepak right now has been something that's happening for a long time, where men in religion and spirituality like to talk about the divine feminine in this abstract way, where it's a muse or a symbol or an archetype or a resource, rather than a lived ethic or a redistribution of power. And where this becomes dangerous is men like Deepak Chopra making millions of dollars teaching about the divine feminine. And when a woman feels exhausted or angry or constrained, then Deepak Chopra will say, you need to align with flow. You need to soften your resistance. You need to release attachment. You need to trust the universe. And men like Deepak Chopra, who talk about the divine feminine, never ask who is benefiting from her flexibility. Why is she absorbing disproportionate labor? Is her anger actually a sane response that should tell us that something's wrong here? What boundary or refusal is needed in this system? And these teachings about the divine feminine talk about how healing comes from softening, but never from saying no, never from withdrawing care, never from disrupting harmony, never from changing the system itself. So this is why I'm so distrustful of men teaching me about the divine feminine, because they tend to do it in ways that still center themselves and what they need from women. And I'm just personally no longer interested in any form of spirituality that asks just women to soften without asking systems to change.
I loved that video. So I thought that this was a really good point, because going back to some of the stuff I said about Gamergate, right? A lot of the men who had a really negative reaction to Anita Sarkeesian pointing out that women within certain narratives only exist to service the male character were upset with her for wanting women to have more autonomy within how they appear within media, right? And really what that boils down to is men wanting for their narrative, their ideas to always be what society lives and breathes on, right? Women aren't supposed to have their own sort of ideas. They aren't supposed to have their own sort of journey. They're supposed to live within the shadow of a man. What are a lot of the culture war issues trying to encourage this sort of existence where men live this way and women live beneath them, right? This stuff's all connected once again. And it's not a coincidence that this dude was in the Epstein files, but also teaching about this idea of the feminine figure, the divine feminine, as this sort of abstracted thing that is supposed to exist only to relent, only to provide softness and care for, of course, the masculine, right? I sometimes get wrapped up in some of the polarity conversations, because I do think that there is something to it in that, you know, you give and take, and some people play certain roles within a certain relationship. And I think, at least within my sexuality, the common word we often use for that is masculine and feminine. But the idea that people have to be constrained within these things and that they should only act within a certain script, to me, has always been a problem, because it's a degree of freedom that I don't think is ever fully expanded to women, right? To people, especially designated female in this country, in this world, really. Men are sort of encouraged to have a wide range of experiences, while women are sort of just encouraged to be mothers and then punished for not quite doing so, right? It's clear that Epstein, a lot of his friends, and a lot of the billionaires and thinkers that he was connected to wanted to exist in a world where women were heard a bit less. And when things happened to them, they were believed not nearly as much as the men that were involved in the situation. And again, it's all connected.
A New York Magazine article came out today about how Jeffrey Epstein allegedly helped Woody Allen and his wife/daughter's daughter graduate high school by donating to the school. So before Mia Farrow was ever with Woody Allen, she was with Andre Previn, and they adopted a daughter named Soon-Yi. Then once Mia and Woody became an item, Woody became like an unofficial stepdad to Soon-Yi. No, Soon-Yi is not a blood relative of Woody, and she's not even officially his stepdaughter because Mia and Woody were never married. But none of that even really matters because when Woody met Soon-Yi, it was in the context of his girlfriend saying, "This is my kid." Later, when Soon-Yi was 21, Mia found explicit photos that Woody had taken of her, and obviously that did not go over well. Things between Woody and Mia fall apart over that, and fast forward a few years, and Soon-Yi and Woody end up getting married when she is 27, he was 62, and Woody and Soon-Yi have been together ever since. They have 2 adopted daughters together.
Yeah, I mean, if there was someone I was expecting to see in the Epstein files, it was definitely Woody Allen. Like, of the people, least surprising person in the files. And you have to think about that too. Like, Woody Allen was still well celebrated, right? Woody Allen was still someone who was able to go on and have his career, have celebration for what he's done, and be known for something other than at least what I mostly know him for, which is being a creep, right? But a lot of the people who called him out at the time, they got blacklisted, right? Like Roman Polanski is another example, right? You really do start to get the vision when you see this stuff that there is a certain amount of space carved out in society to keep stuff like this happening. And you can maybe even trace that back to how these stories are even covered to begin with. Right?
Here's some additional observations I made about billionaires from the Epstein emails. To start, they tend to receive the news first, and so they can act on that news first as well. It usually flows from to them, to a media company, then to us, which allows them an unfair advantage to trade on that news and make more money. And by the time that we know, it's too late. In their social circles, who has more money really doesn't matter since they all have a lot. What matters is who can get them in what they perceive as is exclusive spaces and events. And that's why Epstein had a lot of power over a lot of billionaires. They aren't as smart as you may believe they might be. If you took away all their money, they would not be able to gain that money back and will likely die a pretty mediocre life. And they don't really have a true support circle. And that sadness is very evident when they reach out to hang out with someone and that person cannot hang out with them because they're busy. They don't really know how to spend their time or what to do with their time because we work. They don't have to work.